The teller's name was Marcus, and I'd known him for 6 years, ever since he transferred to the Riverbend branch from the one on Custer Road. He knew my coffee order from the gas station next door because we'd run into each other there more mornings than not. He knew I took my walks at 6 a.m. before the Oklahoma heat made it unbearable by 10. On a Tuesday morning in November, I drove to Prairie National Bank on Kellogg Avenue in Wichita, walked up to his window, and asked to withdraw $2,500 from my checking account for a truck repair. Marcus smiled at me the way he always did. Then he typed my account number into his terminal, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not confusion, recognition of a problem. He looked at that screen for a beat too long, the kind of pause a man takes when he's deciding how much of what he's seeing to say out loud. Then he looked up at me, and he was working hard to keep his face even. He said, "Mr. Doyle, would you give me just a moment?" He picked up the phone at his station and turned his shoulder away from me, the way people do when they don't want you reading their lips. He set it down and said, "Someone's going to come speak with you real quick, if that's all right." He'd said my name twice inside of a minute, and I have spent 41 years driving trucks across this country, reading dashboards and manifests and men's faces at truck stops at 3 in the morning, and I know what it looks like when somebody is steering you gently toward bad news. I stepped off to the side of the lobby and waited. Around me, the bank went on with its ordinary business, a man in a Carhartt jacket at the next window, a woman filling out a deposit slip against the counter, the low hum of the drive-through speaker. Ordinary except for me, standing there with my hands in my jacket pockets, already knowing, in the pit of my stomach, more or less exactly what was coming. A door opened to my left, and a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back tight, came toward me with her hand already extended. She said, "Mr. Doyle, I'm Carol Whitfield, branch manager. Could I get you to step back to my office for just a minute?" I said that would be fine. I followed her down a short hallway lined with the kind of motivational posters banks put up, past a break room where somebody had left a coffee pot half full, into a corner office with 2 monitors and a window that looked out on the parking lot and the gas station, where Marcus and I had traded small talk for years. She shut the door. She sat down behind her desk, and she turned one of her monitors so I could see it, slow and deliberate, like she'd rehearsed exactly how she wanted to do this. She said, "Mr. Doyle, before I tell you what's going on, I want to show you something. At 7:52 this morning, somebody came into this branch and withdrew the full balance out of your personal checking account. That was $19,340. She let that number sit in the room a second. Then she said, "The withdrawal slip had a signature on it that matched yours closely enough that the teller who took it didn't flag it in the moment. It was our fraud monitoring system that caught it about 20 minutes later, after the transaction had already gone through. I pulled the security footage once the flag came in, and I think you need to see it." She clicked her mouse. The screen filled with a camera feed from above the teller line, time-stamped 7 hours, 52 minutes, and 4 seconds in the corner, the picture sharper than you'd expect from a bank camera because this branch had been renovated 2 years back. The person standing at that window was a man. Medium build, ball cap pulled low, but not so low that I couldn't see the jawline, the way he stood with his weight on his left leg, the exact way he'd stood in my kitchen 1,000 times growing up. I sat there and looked at that screen for longer than I needed to, long enough that Carol Whitfield had the decency not to say a word, not to move, just to let me have the silence the moment was asking for. Finally I said, very quiet, "That's my son. That's Tyler Doyle." She said, "We weren't certain, sir, but that's what we suspected, given the account holder's name and, well, there's a resemblance." I said, "He's not on that account. Never has been." She said, "No, sir, the account's in your name alone." And that's the trouble, because the signature on the withdrawal slip was forged closely enough to pass a first glance, but it doesn't match what we have on file once you look at the loop on the capital D. We've placed a fraud hold on the transaction, which means the funds are frozen. They haven't cleared for the person who took them. Frozen. I sat with that word a second. I sat with everything underneath it. Everything I had already understood was probably coming. Because, and here's the thing this story turns on, I had known for the better part of a month exactly what was building toward this morning. I said, "Carol, I appreciate how you've handled this. I need to ask you something plain. Is the money still recoverable?" She said, "The cash is gone from the drawer, Mr. Doyle. But with the fraud hold in place, it can't be moved, deposited, or converted anywhere else without triggering an alert. If you file a police report today, and I'd strongly encourage that, the bank will begin our formal recovery process alongside it. I said I'd need a full copy of everything, the transaction record, the forged slip, a still from the camera. She said she'd have it ready within the hour. I said thank you, and I sat back in that chair and looked at the frozen image of my son standing at a teller window at 7:52 in the morning while I'd been 40 miles away in Andale, Kansas, feeding my dog and drinking coffee with no idea what he was doing 2 counties over. But here's what Tyler didn't know walking into that bank. 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning, I had moved every real dollar I had to a different bank altogether. The $19,340 sitting in that Prairie National account wasn't my savings. It was bait. It was the exact number I'd decided I could stand to lose, if that's what it took to get the truth on paper, because I already knew he was going to try. I'd known for 3 weeks, and I had spent every one of those 3 weeks getting ready for this exact Tuesday. My name is Walter Doyle. I'm 68 years old, and I drove long-haul freight for 41 years out of Wichita, Kansas, hauling everything from refrigerated produce to steel coil across every interstate in this country before my knees finally told me to quit in 2019. My son made the mistake every person who tries to take something from their own father eventually makes. He figured that because I was old and alone since his mother passed, and grieving in whatever way an old man grieves, I wasn't paying close enough attention anymore. I want to tell you right now, before this goes any further, I am always paying attention. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to my corner of the internet, and if you've got a minute, drop where you're listening from down in the comments, because I read every single one of them, I promise you that. Let's get into how we got to that Tuesday morning. I drove trucks for 4 decades. Started at 19 for a regional outfit out of Salina, moved up to long haul by 26, and spent the last 22 years leased on with the same company, Heartland Freight Lines, running a route that took me from Wichita up through Denver and out to Salt Lake and back, over and over, week after week, for longer than some marriages last. I put over 3 million miles on the odometer across 5 different trucks. I know engines the way some men know scripture. I know how to read a weigh station scale before I ever get on it, how to feel a bad bearing through the steering wheel before the gauge ever tells you something's wrong, and I know, better than almost anything else in this world, how to read a man's face when he's about to tell me something he doesn't want to say. 41 years on the road teaches you that whether you want it to or not, because every truck stop and every loading dock puts you across from somebody who's either straight with you or isn't, and your whole livelihood depends on knowing which one you're looking at fast. My wife, Carol Ann Doyle, and yes, same first name as the branch manager, which is its own small, strange coincidence that struck me hard that morning, was born Carol Ann Pruitt in Hutchinson, Kansas, in 1955. And she was the most patient woman I ever knew. Patient in the kind of way that wasn't soft. It was disciplined. She taught 4th grade at Andale Elementary for 31 years, and she brought to that classroom the same quality she brought to our marriage and to raising our 2 kids, which was the conviction that people, especially young people, were worth more patience than they'd usually earned yet. She kept a whole shelf of gardening books and a vegetable patch behind our house that she worked from the first thaw in March clear through the first frost in October, and she kept notebooks, actual spiral notebooks, dozens of them over the years, where she wrote down what she'd planted and when and what had worked and what hadn't. After she passed, I found 11 of those notebooks stacked in the garage, and I stood there holding them for longer than I want to admit. Carol Ann died of a stroke in March of 2023. 67 years old, no warning, healthy on a Wednesday, and gone by Thursday morning. That's the kind of loss that doesn't hand you any runway to prepare for it, and I'm not going to walk you through what those first months were like because that part belongs to me, not to this story. What belongs to this story is this. Carol Ann died in March, and by May, 8 weeks later, my son Tyler had brought up my will and my accounts 4 separate times. I had 2 kids. My daughter, Renee, is 41, lives up in Denver with her husband and their boy, works as a nurse practitioner, and calls me every single Sunday evening without fail, and drove down to Kansas 3 times in the 2 months after her mother died without me having to ask her once. She's got her mother's patience in her, That same operational kindness, not the decorative kind. She'd also told me twice over the past year, careful and quiet, that she was worried about her brother, that something about how he'd been talking about my finances didn't sit right with her. I heard her both times. I didn't move on it fast enough, and I'll own that. Tyler is 38. He lives in Derby, a suburb south of Wichita, with his wife, Ashley, and their 2 boys. And he worked, I should say, in equipment financing for a farm implement dealer out on Highway 15. Ashley has the specific manner of someone who has calculated precisely how much warmth a room requires and delivers exactly that much, not a drop more, and in 9 years of being my daughter-in-law, she never once said anything to me that struck me as spontaneous. I loved my son the way you love a child, who's made choices you wouldn't have made, who's turned into a man that's harder to be around than you ever hoped he'd be. He's smart, and he's capable, and he'd had those 2 things aimed in a direction I'd suspected for a couple of years and hadn't wanted to say out loud. Because he was my son, and because Carol Ann had always told me Tyler would find his footing eventually, and I deferred to her on that, the way I deferred to her on most things about people. Then Carol Ann was gone, and Tyler started asking about the estate inside of 2 months. The questions came dressed up right. He'd mentioned a buddy of his whose dad had died without updating a beneficiary form, and what a mess that turned into. He'd mentioned that Ashley's brother did some kind of financial planning work and would be happy to look over anything, no charge, just to help. He mentioned, more than once, that the house on Meridian Road, where Carol Ann and I had raised both our kids, was probably worth a fair piece in this market, and that it might be smart to understand what that meant tax-wise before anything got decided. The house on Meridian Road. The tax implications. I wrote every one of those conversations down in a notebook I kept in my truck's glove box out of 41 years of habit. You don't run freight for 4 decades without learning that if it isn't written down, with a date on it, it didn't happen. Not as far as anybody in a dispute is ever going to believe you. By July, Tyler was asking about my online banking. Said he was worried about me handling it alone at my age. Said he'd helped set up bill pay for Ashley's folks, and it had made their life a whole lot easier. Said he'd be glad to get mine squared away if I just gave him my login so he could configure the settings right. I told him I'd been banking online since before he had a driver's license, and I figured I could keep managing. He said he just wanted to help his old man out. I told him I appreciated it. I wrote that one down too. In September, I came back from the feed store to find Tyler in my den. He had a reason. Said he was hunting for a photo of his mother from a shoebox he remembered being in the closet. And that much was true. There were boxes of Carol Ann's things in there. But when I walked in, he wasn't at the closet. He was sitting at my desk, and he shut my laptop the second he heard the door, quick enough that I clocked it even before I'd fully understood what I was looking at. I didn't say a word about it right then. I wrote it down after he left, and I spent the better part of the next week going through every account I had with the kind of attention I used to give a pre-trip inspection, checking every hose and every bolt, because a man's life depends on not missing the one that matters. I found 2 things. First, my personal checking account had been logged into from an IP address that traced back to Derby, Kansas at 1:40 in the morning on a night in August. 4 minutes, no transactions made, but somebody had gotten in with my password. Somebody who lived in Derby. Second, there was a credit inquiry on my report I hadn't made a pre-qualification pull for a home equity loan against the Meridian Road house submitted online under my name back in July. It hadn't gone anywhere because I'd had a credit freeze in place for years out of plain trucker's caution, the same caution that makes you check your mirrors even on an empty highway. But the inquiry was sitting right there on the report. July. Same month, Tyler was pushing me about online banking access. I sat at my kitchen table a long while with those 2 things in front of me. 41 years on the road teaches you what a pattern looks like when it stops being coincidence, same as I said, and I'd been filing this pattern away in the part of my head where you keep things you aren't ready yet to call by their real name. I was ready now. Next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Nancy Petrovic, 60 years old, handled elder law and estate disputes out of a storefront office above a barbershop on Douglas Avenue, which I mention because the barbershop underneath tells you plenty about what kind of practice sits above it, not fancy, working. I'd gotten her name from an old dispatcher friend of mine whose own father had gone through something similar, and he'd described her the way one careful man describes another he trusts. I walked into Nancy Petrovich's office on a Monday morning with my glove box notebook, a typed summary of what I'd found, and a copy of my will from 2016 that hadn't been touched since Carol Ann died. She went through every page of it without a word, the way the good ones do. No performance, just attention. When she finished, she set it all down and looked at me straight. She said, "Mr. Doyle, I want to ask you something plain. In your own judgment, do you believe your son intends to move against your estate?" I said, "I believe he's already started." I told her the credit pull and the account login weren't coincidence. They were scouting. She asked about my daughter. I told her Renee had warned me twice and wasn't part of any of it, and I was sure of that. She asked what outcome I wanted. I said, "I want what's mine to go where I decide it goes. I want Tyler to understand, when this is over, that I saw it the whole time and had already handled it before he got far enough to do real damage. And I want a record, because 41 years of hauling freight taught me that the paperwork is the only thing that holds up when everything else is somebody's word against somebody else's." She looked at me a second and said, "Those are things we can build toward. Let's talk about how." What Nancy laid out and what I put into motion over the next 3 weeks, with the same discipline I used to bring to a cross-country run on a tight schedule, was this. I dissolved the old joint accounts that still carried Carol Ann's name from before she passed. I set up a revocable living trust, the Walter J. Doyle Family Trust, naming Renee as successor, trustee, and sole beneficiary. I moved the Meridian Roadhouse into that trust. I opened a brand new primary savings account at Golden Plains Credit Union, clear across town, someplace Tyler had never once mentioned or asked about, and moved the bulk of what I had into it. And I left the Prairie National checking account open, sitting there with $19,340 in it, because I understood, plain as reading a odometer, that Tyler had my old password and had been watching that balance. Close the account fast, and he'd feel something had changed and go quiet on me. Leave it sitting there looking like my regular operating money, and he'd see exactly what he was hunting for. I also called Prairie National directly and asked to speak to whoever handled fraud prevention. Got connected to a woman named Deborah Chandler in their compliance office. I told her everything I'd found and everything I expected was coming. Gave her the account number, told her what to watch for, asked her to flag it for extra monitoring, and to call me the second anything moved on it. She told me, "Mr. Doyle, in 19 years doing this job, I've had maybe 4 calls like yours." I asked how those had turned out. She said, "Good, for the folks who made the call." I said that was exactly what I was after. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I drove to that bank to make a small withdrawal for a truck repair, and Marcus froze at his window. I filed a police report that same afternoon at the Wichita PD substation on Rock Road, with an officer named Reyes who wrote down every word careful and told me it'd get kicked to their financial crimes unit, given the amount and what I already had documented. He took the security still, the forged slip, the full transaction record. The detective who caught the case was a woman named Patricia Ohl, mid-50s, sharp and unhurried, and she called me that Thursday and asked me to come in with everything. I brought everything. The glove box notebook with 14 months of dated entries, the printout showing the August login from the Derby IP address, the credit report with the July inquiry. A 3-week timeline I'd built over a weekend, laying out every conversation Tyler and I had about the estate going back to May, dated and cross-checked against my own calendar. Detective Ohl looked at that timeline a long time. She said, "You built this yourself, Mr. Doyle?" I told her 41 years of keeping a logbook doesn't just switch off because you retire. She asked about the credit inquiry, and I told her exactly how it traced. She asked about the August login, and I told her the bank's own compliance department had confirmed it in writing once I'd flagged it. She sat quiet a moment, then said, "With the footage, the forged signature, the credit pull, and your own documentation, you've built most of a case yourself." I told her that had been the whole idea. She asked me the same thing Nancy had, more or less why I hadn't come to the police back in September when I first found the login. I told her the same answer I'd have given anybody. In September, I had an oddity, a login from the wrong place at a strange hour. And an oddity isn't a case, it's a hunch. What I had in November was a case, the footage, the forged signature, the full shape of it, laid out end to end. I needed the whole thing built before I brought it to anybody with a badge. She said she understood that, and that they'd open the investigation formally and be in touch within the week. I called Renee from the parking lot of that police substation. She picked up on the first ring. I walked her through all of it: the bank, Marcus, the manager's office, the footage, the report. Told her about the August login and the July credit inquiry and the 3 weeks I'd spent quietly moving everything before that Tuesday. She was quiet the whole way through, the kind of quiet that means somebody's actually listening instead of waiting for their turn to talk. When I finished, she asked, "Dad, how long have you known?" I told her I'd been building the paper trail since September, that I'd known the shape of it since then, and that I hadn't told her sooner because I didn't want her carrying something she couldn't act on. She was quiet another second, then asked if I was okay. I told her I was clear, that clear was about all that was available to me right then. She asked if she should come down. I told her not yet, to wait till I had a better sense of the timeline, that there'd be a point where I'd need her here, and I'd tell her when. Then she said, "Mom would have seen this coming a year ago." I told her I knew that Carol Ann had always been faster than me on people, that I was better with engines and numbers, and the human stuff took me longer to work out. I drove home to Meridian Road and sat out on the back steps in the November light and looked at what was left of Carol Ann's garden, gone ragged the way a garden goes when the person who understood it isn't there to keep after it anymore. There was still a shape to it, because she'd built it with good bones, but the details were slipping, and I didn't have the knowledge to hold them together. I thought about those notebooks in the garage. I went and got them, brought them out to the steps, and read through them in the fading light for the better part of an hour, following her handwriting through years of seasons she wasn't going to see again, understanding for maybe the first time exactly what she'd been growing back there and why. The investigation ran 10 weeks. Detective Ohl called me 3 separate times, and eventually an assistant district attorney named Frank Suarez got involved, methodical, no rush to him, who went through my documentation with the kind of care it deserved. What they pieced together was this: Tyler had gotten into my accounts through the laptop in my den back in September, confirmed by the digital logs. He'd used that access to track my balances for 2 months straight. He'd submitted the July equity application that my credit freeze had blocked cold. He'd forged my signature on the November withdrawal slip and walked it into the Kellogg Avenue branch, where the bank's fraud system had caught what the teller's eye alone hadn't. A search warrant on his phone turned up a notes app where he'd been logging my account balance for weeks. The last entry timestamped 7:31 that Tuesday morning, 21 minutes before he walked through those doors. It read, "Ball, $19,340 going today." He'd been watching that number the whole time, waiting on a morning he figured I had no reason to check it myself. He didn't know I'd put that appointment on my own calendar 3 weeks in advance. Didn't know I'd asked Carol Whitfield's office to call me the second anything moved. Didn't know about Deborah Chandler in compliance, or the monitoring flag, or the new account sitting at Golden Plains clear across town holding everything the Prairie National account only appeared to hold. He'd spent 2 months watching a number on a screen and walked into a building to take it, never knowing the building was ready and waiting on him. Ashley, once the investigation reached her through texts between her and Tyler that got pulled into evidence, hired her own lawyer separate from his and gave a statement describing her involvement as general awareness only, saying things had gone further than she'd expected. Detective Ohl told me about that statement with the same dry, been-here-before tone I imagine she uses for most statements like it. Tyler was charged in February with theft, forgery, and identity fraud. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea, and it got set for trial in the spring. He didn't reach out to me between that Tuesday and the charges getting filed. I didn't reach out to him. Renee called every Sunday like always, and we talked about her boy, and my knees, and the weather coming down off the Rockies, and mostly we left Tyler out of it because there wasn't anything useful left to say that wasn't already sitting in a detective's file. I went back to see Nancy Petrovic in December to confirm the trust was buttoned up tight. She said it was clean, that none of the criminal proceedings would touch it, that the house and everything else was fully protected. I asked her about the $19,340. She said the recovery process through the bank was moving, that given the strength of the evidence they expected to make me whole might take a few months. I told her I'd left that money in there willing to lose every dollar of it, if that's what building the case required, and that getting it back was better than I'd planned on. She looked at me and said most people in my position didn't think about it that way. I told her most people in my position hadn't spent 41 years reading logbooks for a living. Tyler took a guilty plea in April. Full restitution, a suspended sentence, 5 years probation, a permanent mark on his record. Frank Suarez called after and told me it was about the strongest outcome the evidence could support. I told him I understood and appreciated the work. The restitution came through in June, and I drove it straight to Golden Plains and wrote the date down in my notebook, same as I'd written down everything else. And then I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and just sat with the fact that it was finished, which is a different kind of sitting than sitting in the middle of it, and takes some getting used to. Renee drove down from Denver the weekend after the plea, and we sat out on the back steps in the June evening, and she helped me figure out a plant along the fence line her mother had put in that I'd never been able to identify off the notebook alone. She knew it because Carol Ann had told her about it once, years back, and she'd held on to it. Said her mother had planted it because certain birds came through in the fall, and that was exactly the seed they wanted. I told her I'd been trying to work out what it needed. She said it wanted less water than you'd think, that her mother had written that down somewhere. We found the page later. Less water than you'd think. That was Carol Ann all over, precise right down in the margins of things nobody else would have thought to write down at all. We talked about Tyler once that evening, for maybe 20 minutes, the way you talk about something that's settled, but not over. She asked how it had gotten this far, and I told her I figured the answer was the same one. It always comes down to, he believed I wasn't watching closely enough. And that belief felt comfortable enough to him that the whole plan turned real in his head before he ever accounted for what a man who spent his life reading dashboards and manifests actually notices. She said, "He should have known you better." I told her he'd known me 38 years and never once updated the file. The garden's coming back some. Not what Carol Ann had it at, not her eye for it, but better than it was. I've been working my way through her notebooks as careful as I know how, learning now what I should have learned while she was still here to teach it to me straight. That fence line planting put out its seeds right on schedule in October, same as she'd written it would, and I sat at the kitchen window on more than one cold morning and watched the exact birds she'd meant for show up and take them. She'd have been satisfied by that. Not surprised, satisfied, the particular quiet way she got satisfied by things she'd planned out carefully that went ahead and worked the way she'd known they would. She built that garden for the birds and for October mornings and for whoever ended up standing at that kitchen window after she was gone. She built it, same as she built most things, not just for the day she was living in, but for the one that came after. I built my paperwork the same way, not for the morning I needed it, but for the morning after that, the one where having it laid out plain would decide what was still possible for me and what wasn't. 41 years of a trucker's habit put to use on the most personal thing I've ever had to run through my own logbook. The record was the record, and at the end of the day, it was mine. If any part of this sat with you the way it sat with me, tell me down in the comments which moment got you. And if you're new around here, go on and subscribe, because I've got a lot more of these to tell you, and I'll see you, and I mean this, next week.